We'll transition over to Doug, who will go through all of the different pieces that the ILO management engine actually impacts as well. So take it away, Peter.
Thank you. This is going to be interesting because this one is not. Here we go. All right, now I can see what I'm doing as well. So that should hopefully improve the experience quite a bit.
Let me do a quick intro. I forgot
Please.
to do that. So Peter is our lead planner for our embedded management capabilities. This includes ILO, as we talked about, our onboard administrator, and all of the associated tools associated with that. Finally, when we go over to Doug, so we can just transition over. Doug is actually our lead development manager for everything ILO management engine, and as he says, the awesomeness of ILO throughout. So take it away, Peter.
All right, thanks, guys. All right, so firmware. Okay, firmware is an industry disease. It's just the way it is. All right. Back in the heyday, we used to have servers. We used to have rack and rows of basically one P or 2P, 1U or 2Us, basically standing down the aisle. And it was fairly simple to manage and update those things, simply because we didn't use virtualization. We had a simple NIC in there. If we were advanced, we had a fiber channel HBA. Each of them went to their own switch. You would land the firmware on it when you provisioned it the first time. You put an OS on it and an application. You probably wouldn't touch it for the next 3 years. Once infrastructure starts to get a little bit more complex and there's more functionality going into it, think stuff like virtual connect, think stuff like onboard administrators, places where you have a multitude of servers basically be managed from one perspective, you kind of like really need to come up with a much more holistic solution. Updating servers one by one is just not a very effective way of going about it, plus the fact that there are interdependencies between all the different things in the infrastructure, and not understanding the interdependencies between them will basically result in a situation that typically blows up in a quote-unquote loud, grotesque military manner. So the way to basically approach this has been through a bunch of very tedious written down processes about how to actually get through it. To give you an idea, this is the process up in the top that used to be what we actually had customers go through. And this was actually a pretty slim down process compared to what you had in most of the industry. Right? This involves a full-time person sitting and looking through the website trying to figure out what was updated. Once they figure out what was updated, what else needed to be updated. Downloading the individual piecemeal pieces, reading through release notes, trying to figure out how do these things actually come together. Making a big spreadsheet with a recipe on it, right? It's almost like having, trying to cook a new meal in your kitchen for the first time. You want to try to do that before the guests arrive, preferably the weekend before, because otherwise, it may be too salty or what have you not. So, you would have a dude that would basically try this on a series of development servers, would figure out, this doesn't work, have to change the process and so on and so forth. And once you figured out how to actually do it, you would take the entire environment offline and you would start actually updating. This is time taken away from you as an operator, but it's also time taken away from the company because the servers are not doing quote unquote what you asked them or what you paid for them to do. So what we did with HP Sum was we said, okay, we're going to have to update this in a much smarter way, but we have to do this without introducing a new series of processes into the data center. So what we wanted to do was to make sure that we aligned with the exact same process that pretty much everyone has been using for the last 25 years, which is you got an operating system, right? You got a baseline on that. That's done by your build team. They bring that out into the data center. As that ages over time, you begin to get hot fixes. You look at those hot fixes. Do they actually apply to me? If they do, you deploy them out using the same tool as you did for deploying the OS. Then at some point, the OS vendor, being it Microsoft, being it VMware, being it SLES, being it Red Hat, whatever, will bring out a service pack. The build team will bring that into the lab. They'll bang on it for a couple of months. And once they're happy with it, they'll deploy that, and that now becomes the new baseline. Same exact process is what we've done for HP Sum. And to give you a little bit of an idea, it used to take about 8 hours to get through a rack of blade servers. All right, so 4 enclosures with virtual connect and OAs and servers and what have you not. It took about 8 hours to get through that. What we're going to do here now is we're actually going to go in and do an entire rack, not just of blade servers, but of mixed servers which is MLs, DLs, SLs, and BLs, running all the way back from generation 5, so G5 all the way up to and including Gen 8. We're going to do that in about 10 minutes, soup to nuts. Okay, these are pretty big kind of like changes and boasts, so don't take my word for it. We're going to log into my environment here, and we're going to see it in action. What I have here is I have a management server that's sitting on my network inside, it's actually sitting next to the rack, but it doesn't matter. He can basically see both the management network and the production network, because I want to be able to update both the management components, which would be the onboard administrators, the ILOs, and so on and so forth, as well as the VC, the virtual connect that hangs off there, as well as all the servers in the front. So what I did was I downloaded a service pack for Proliant. It is a single download. It comes off the web page. You bring that down. It's an ISO file. You explode that. You drop that onto your file share. I then took a couple of hotfixes and versioned them such that these hotfixes are actually quote-unquote newer than the service pack that I'm working against. So what it means is that we're basically simulating that whole thing of having a baseline and then hotfixes that applies post the baseline was launched. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to start up HP Sum. First, you're going to get a couple of welcome screens that basically just talks about, here's the greatness of us and here's what we do and so on and so forth. And the first thing that happens, you'll notice in this screen, I actually have multiple baselines going on. This is what John was talking about. Obviously, if you are in a data center environment, you are going to have lines of businesses that want or are running on different hardware, running on different processes, different update cadences, and so on and so forth than other parts of the data center. It may actually be desirable to run on one baseline for finance and another one for manufacturing and so on and so forth. So what we have here is that we loaded in the standard baseline, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to add in my hotfix repository, which is basically just a pointer down to that directory where I dropped in my components. The cool thing about all the components now from HP is, as John said, we went through a massive re-engineering on this. So we rewrote all of the component wrappers. So all the component wrappers now understands what they do themselves, what version they're at, what repository they belong to, but also which other dependencies do they have, which firmware do they go with, which driver do they go with, which interdependencies do they have against other components, as well as in which order do these things need to be applied to the environment in order to have a known safe update process. So what happened was, as I basically started to add in these repositories, you can see the repositories are basically configuring themselves and declaring all the config rules on the fly. So if I were to drop in a new hotfix or a new service pack, I don't have to redo all of my dependencies. That is done fully automated for me. We go in and take a look at the repository in itself. What he comes up and tells us is right now he is supporting 405 different things that HP is shipping. That is basically everything back from G5 all the way up to and including the Gen 8 servers that we have released, as well as all the options and all of the components that has HP stamped on it that you've been able to buy from us from within the last 3 years. You also see in here that it supports setup and config of Matrix. So the Blade System Matrix environment, or the Cloud System Matrix as it's called now, as well as obviously our application system and our virtualization system. So all of that is covered from within here. This is a one-stop shop. I could go in here, I can go in, I can explode, I can, take a look at what the different things are, and just to give you a little bit of a taste, I mean, G5 server, G6 servers, G5 servers, if we roll down here, we're going to start to see MSAs and storage and, so on and so forth. So it's really the entire portfolio. Now, once I've quote-unquote selected my content, which are my baselines, what I'm going to do next is I'm going to go in and I'm going to evaluate a series of targets. This can be acquired either by doing the good old-fashioned ping spray, right, which is basically, a slightly organized denial of service attack, or you can go in and obviously do that through your integration in with your LDAP or your Active Directory servers, and basically just lock into those, get your organizational units back, and then begin to select hosts from there. Once you've done that, then what I've done in here is I've just taken and grouped things together. It's just to make the interface look a little bit more user-friendly. All reality is most people are never going to be using this interface in the first place, simply because they're going to be using the full command line interface that comes with this, that allows you to, via APIs, integrate to other platforms, or some of the integration points that we are already bringing out of the box. So, for example, with Sim 7, all this functionality is available as a one-click within the Sim platform. Now, what we're going to do here is we're going to take all these servers here, and we're going to start updating against them. So let's start here. We're going to take some Red Hat servers and some SUSE servers. Now, in here, there are kind of like two ways of setting this up. One way is to do it the old-fashioned way, which is what I'm doing, which is to basically just use a username and a password. Now, most people would tend not to do that, simply because you got different passwords on your different OS routes. So what you can do instead is you can basically trust the HP Sum service into each of your servers through either your Active Directory, through your policy servers or whatever, and thereby not having to actually enter usernames and passwords. In this case, I entered usernames and passwords, and I'm going to tell these guys to go off to the races. What happens now is that Sum actually goes in, locks into each of these targets, and I'm going to grab the Windows host and the OAs at the same time. Sum now locks into each of these targets and opens a transient SOAP server. So all of this sits exclusively in memory. There is no persistence on the actual boxes of anything until we actually declare that we want to do the updates. This SOAP server does 4 different things. It does a inventory collect of all the hardware, and that's obviously not just asking the OS, because there's a ton of things down on these boards that the OS never knows about. CPLDs, you know, other sorts of logic programmable things that the OS actually just physically does not enumerate. So it does a hardware inventory collect, does a software inventory collect, then it does a dependency check. And that dependency check is that every time we detect that something needs to be done, every time we detect that a driver or a piece of firmware needs to be updated, that is added into the list, and we then go back and we check our dependency database to say, what else do I need to apply at the same time? It also checks against whether we have the right operating system services running, as well as whether we have the correct build tools and what else is needed for the update process to run smoothly, whether those things are in place. Then the 4th thing is that it does what we call an inter-target communication. And we're going to see that guy actually come up here. That intercommunicator actually already come up and said, you had 2 onboard administrators. I'm only going to update the one that's actually active. The other one we're going to ignore. And the one that was active just came back up and said, hang on, you're trying to update all this infrastructure, yet there are pieces within the infrastructure that should be updated along with everything else that you did not declare in your list. So let me add those in for you. You forgot the ILOs and you forgot the virtual connect. Okay, cool. So let's add those things in. We're going to add in the ILOs. The ILOs are already under the security umbrella of the OA, so we don't actually have to do anything about those. However, the virtual connect manager is in a separate security domain, so we're going to enter a username and a password for that one as well. Oh, fat fingered it again. All right, so these guys are now basically off discovering. You can do this with as many as 500 targets in parallel. Once we get a little bit further down the road and we start actually contributing some of our internal pieces back into the open source tree, we are using tools like, for example, OpenSSL, which has some threading issues in it right now. So we're actually rewriting OpenSSL, and we're going to be contributing that back out to source, so back out to the community. Once we're done with those exercises, we believe we're going to be hitting about 5,000 targets in parallel, which is just an ungodly amount of servers at the same time. What you can see here is that they're right now running through all these discovery steps. We're almost done with the discovery in itself. I'm already beginning to get some indications that I need to do some work afterwards, because I've left a couple of, shall we call them, Easter eggs inside of the architecture here to make sure that we actually have some failed dependencies, so we can go in and actually see what happens when stuff like that goes wrong. You can see my Windows guy just came back up and said failed dependencies. So while this one is running, is there any questions? No?
You mentioned it ties into AD, that you can pull
Yeah.
AD groups out of it.
Yep.
How does it know? Does it then scan and say, okay, these machines are physical? How does it know if it's just pulling from AD, what's physical, what's virtual at that point? If you
It
have
doesn't
that
matter.
environment?
It doesn't matter, because one of the beautiful things about HP Sum is that HP Sum online updates both virtual and physical things, right? So if you run ESX5, we can actually patch the guests while they're running. That's one of the cool things about HP Sum that no one else in the industry really understands how to do, right? You go in and you look at, you go in and you look at the way that Dell does it, you go in and look at the way IBM does it, or even the way Cisco does it, right? It either requires that you take the system offline, or in the case of Cisco, UCS, what they actually do is that if you are virtual, then they migrate the virtual guests away. They take that physical server, so that the actual hypervisor, and they boot that into their state machine. And I know that they call it online, but let's be honest with each other. That's technical BS, right? It's technically not incorrect, but it's actually BS, because in all reality, that piece of iron is not doing what you paid for it to do, right? It's offline, and you're now basically, you're executing your VMs somewhere else, great, but that's not really a Cisco technology, that's a VMware technology, right? So what we're doing here is that all these targets are actually going to be updated online. We are going to flash and activate both the firmware and the drivers, as well as all the configs that goes with it. While the system is up, the application is running and the users are live.
I don't know why I'd want HP touching my virtual machines.
We're not touching your virtual machines.
I mean, what would I need you to do any patching or driver
So-
update on my virtual machines for? I'm not using
So your virtual
HP
drivers, for example?
hardware directly. on
No, but your virtual drivers, for example, do have a dependency back down on the actual physical hardware. So what happens is that we obviously work with all the OS vendors, right? So when we come out with a new set of firmware that may expose a new function on, say, an HBA, right? Then VMware actually goes out and they start writing a virtual driver for that, right? That needs to go in through the WebM kit, right? And actually gets injected into the VMware tools. Now, instead of having that as a two-pass update where we first patch the base label and then go in and inject that, and go into a separate set of consoles and actually remediate the actual VMs, we can do all of that in a single pass from right here. That saves you a ton of time. All right, so we're done with discovering all of this infrastructure. What we're going to do is we're going to go to the last screen, and we saw that we had a couple of failed dependencies along the way. So the first one here basically comes up and said, well, you're trying to install an inside agent, but the server doesn't have the SNMP servers running. That is required in order for a successful installation and config of this. So I now have two options. I can either go back out to that box and I can start up the SNMP agent. Because that is an event on the system and my SOAP server is still sitting out there, he will detect that that happened and will then flip the bit and say, all good to go. The other way of doing this is basically to do like I'm doing here, which is basically going to say, you know what? We're not going to install this guy. You take him out of the install set, and now everything's green across the board. Couple of cool things in here that we always hear, right, is you're in a multi-vendor environment. You're flashing firmware on your HBA or on your storage-capable NIC. That firmware is not yet recognized or authorized by the storage vendor, which may or may not be HP. So therefore, I need to be able to update my firmware without actually, for example, installing my or updating my my iSCSI initiator in this case. So we've always given people the opportunity of flashing subcomponents of firmware, but we highly recommended you not to do it simply because it's extremely complex and the chances of stuff going wrong is unfortunately pretty high. Now that we have an engine that can do everything for us, we can essentially just go and say, you know what, we're going to keep ourselves on the old version of the iSCSI initiator because that is compliant against the, whatever array I'm running against in the background. Now you're compliant against HP and you're compliant against the array vendor, so you get both of the best of the both worlds at the same time. This is literally, the analogy is that this is actually to have your cake and eat it at the same time. So we flicked this one over, he was done. I have the same dependency issue over here. We're gonna take this guy out, say okay to that, and then we have one more in here. We're gonna grab that and say no thank you to that. And now you will see that the install button lit up down here. If I press go, at this point my rack will be updated to the baseline that I have chosen. There's going to be a certain amount of runtime on that, but all of that is going to happen while the system is still up. Yep.
And it's smart enough to do the OAs and the virtual connect.
Absolutely.
In the right order.
Everything's done in the right order, and should something go wrong along the way, oh, it's because I have virtual connect on there. Hang on a second. Let me just get my VC out. If something actually goes wrong, I can choose to roll back the whole thing to where it came from. So as the first ones in the industry, we support full rollback on all the drivers and all the firmwares. There are full checkpoints along the way saying, got to do this first, then do that. There are breakpoints, there are wait points, so there's literally a massive process tree behind this with, you know, here's where you could do stuff in parallel, here's where you got a synchronization node back, and, you know, so on and so forth. All that is fully understood. This also means that if you actually upgrade it to a new baseline, but you want to get back to the original baseline, you go in, you load that baseline in the first screen, basically say, well, you know what, give me the older baseline, and then you go in and use force options, and now everything's basically brought back to where it came from. Other thing that John mentioned, scheduling. I'm just going to grab this guy here back in. We can now go in and obviously schedule all these updates, so we create a schedule. If I could actually...
And you can do reports all along here, right?
Oh, absolutely. Reporting is all the way along here. So I can go in, and in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take the guys who are in central daylight, and I'm going to move them over here. I'm going to set up when I actually want this update to go. We'll do that on Saturday. And I press save, and all of the updates are now brought down to scratch space on the target, and a job is scheduled on those. That job is obviously persisted, so even if you reboot the server along the way, the SOAP server actually brings himself back up and recommunicates with everything. The last thing I want to show you is around change management, because change management is fairly difficult in an environment with drivers and firmwares and what have you not. So what we actually have here is we have a series of reports that will go in, and these are obviously comes out in both HTML and XML, right? I mean, most people use the XML. They like to view the HTML because you can actually read it, but the XML is what you stick into your database, right? And what happens here is, you know, get a college kid to write you an XSLT and then it will all work. But there are 5 reports. One that tells you what was the inventory that we had, so what baseline did we take. Then we look at what is on the infrastructure already. Where is the infrastructure at in terms of firmware and drivers right now? Then we look at where it should be based on the repository selections that we did. We basically say, okay, here's where we're at, here's where we need to upgrade to. And then there is a report that goes in and tells you about which dependencies actually failed along the way. So if you, like me, just went out and deselected some of the updates, you have a fallout report that will basically tell you, here's what you need to go back and do. And then once everything's done, you now have the installation details, and those installation details between all, it goes in and gives you, you know, by component, what came to standard out, what was locked by the component, what was the outcome of the installation, blah, 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 what went into the Windows lock, what went into the Linux sys lock, and so on and so forth. Between those 5 reports, because everything is tagged with unique numbers and unique target codes, you can now draw a red line between here's what I had in my repository, here's what I had in my infrastructure, here's where I needed to be in my infrastructure, here's what I asked to get updated, and here's what actually got updated. And you now have full change management control across your entire update process. The reports, I mean, we can just generate them up here. They take a few seconds to generate. Any questions while the report generator is chewing on it?
I just didn't notice when I did the report, was there a setting that it would email the report or something directly?
You can email the report, but what actually happens is that as you run HPSum, it actually makes the reports in the background, and unless that you choose to generate them, quote unquote, it doesn't actually persist them, right? So you can set that up with actually capturing the log and emailing them somewhere, but that actually is part of the SIM integration.
My thought was on the whole, if I'm scheduling, say, I want that one section to go on Saturday at 2 a.m.
Right.
Will it then, when it's done, send me the report so I
When
don't have to jump on and look at it?
When it is done, what you actually do is that you want to go in and you want to run the report again. So what you do is that you run the tool through the first step. And what it actually, you basically just load the tool to the point where you are on that screen that said targets, right? And then you basically press generate report, and it now goes out and harvests everything from the last session.
Okay.
Yeah.
But that means me getting back on the system again to do it.
Yeah, but most people actually do this in scripting, right? Because, as I said, 90% of the people who use this system actually use the command line interface, right? Whether it is through SIM, which has a CLI integration with some, yeah, say that 10 times fast, or through the, or simply through that you know, people will run a set of preset scripts. The beautiful thing about having this as a scriptable environment is that unlike what you see in the rest of the industry, doing updates of drivers or firmware is purely a push operation. You have a operator sitting somewhere that says initiate this, and it now pushes down to the boxes. When you have a scriptable environment like this, what happens is that most of the customers actually update their systems in a pull fashion. So as they go through their initial provisioning and build scripts, what they will do is that they will launch a script up against the HP SUM server, which also runs as a service, and that will then begin to update the targets as they're asking to get updated. So you see a bunch of the Linux guys, for example, basically just saying, well, you know what? Every month we're going to do maintenance. So what we're going to do is we're just going to schedule a cron job that actually goes up and pulls whenever that specific server is in its service window.
So you're saying most people do that?
Yeah.
But I think maybe most people in enterprises, maybe. Most people in SMB,
Right.
I don't think that's the case. Most SMBs are not scripting it. They're having to go in and manually do it.
Right.
Yeah, even
So
big
having the
size.
ability to have it then, they do it and it sends them and tells them a report,
Mm-hmm.
is a huge benefit for the single, maybe 3-4 person IT shop,
Yep.
instead of them having to go in every time. So the rationale of, I'm gonna script it every time, that's
no,
not really a good sell.
And it
Not
makes
for a lot
sense
of
what you're saying.
environments.
I mean, it makes sense. And that you know, the beautiful thing about HP SUM is we cut a version of HP SUM every single time we cut a service pack. So that's something that we'll totally take back to engineering. That makes sense.
Yeah, I can see a lot of shops that would even range up into the mid-size where they're talking about 50 to 100 systems, all said and done as far as x86, where they would not script this simply because they either don't have the time or don't see the need to invest the time it would take to script it.
Yeah, they
Because
might do their updates once a month, once every couple
Exactly.
months,
Right.
even up to a couple hundred systems.
Yeah.
They're only doing it every few months, so they're not.
Yeah,
Like,
Yeah,
I could take hours to script it, or I could just go in every couple months and go click, 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 done.
Yeah.
Yep.
No, it makes perfect sense. I mean, and that's frankly also why we have made some of the integrations over to other suites already, right? So I mean, you know, it's one of those things where we love all our children, but you know, there are some of our children we love slightly more than others, right? So you know, obviously, so obviously, what happened was that the first integration point was against Inside Manager, right? And Inside Manager actually does all that, including the collection of the logs and so on and so forth. So it really truly is a one-click update. We're going to get integrations out against HPSA, which is the server automation stuff, which is the old Opsware stuff. There's going to be out against vCenter. There's going to be out against Operations Manager and Config Manager from Microsoft. And we're looking at some of the other suites as well. So, I mean, and that's kind of like the approach, you know, what we basically said was, listen, wow, there's a ton of stuff that needs to be re-engineered. Let's get the basics right first. And then as we move further down the timeline, you know, we'll start to put the bells and whistles on this stuff, right?
Time for the other
So-
favorite son to come
Yeah.
Yeah.
When,
So
we were
on-
talking about children we love more. I
Does
thought
that
you were gonna
URL
give my
change
introduction.
every time it's ran?
That one up there?
Yeah, to
no,
get to this.
no, it's persistent.
The URL's persistent?
Yeah, that's persistent.
Okay, so,
It's sticky.
so theoretically, we could have it run and just go to that link
Yep.
every time, and then just get the report from it.
Yep. Any last questions before I turn it over to some of the other exciting stuff with Doug? The awesomeness of ILO.
And Peter's gonna be with us tomorrow during a panel, so we're gonna try and do a podcast, so if you got questions you think of tonight, we're gonna hit them up tomorrow.
Right. And I'll probably be having a glass of wine with you later today, so if you come
Yes.
up with something in between, just let me know.
You might want one before the panel.
Well-
Just saying.
I